Oh, there we go. We have Wendell. Promote to panelist. All right. Looks like when Wendell came in through the attendee link, so.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there we go. Hey, Wendell.
I was in the Matrix for a little while. I couldn't get out.
I joined that same link, so I was in there too.
But then I joined the right one, and it kept saying, "Please wait. The meeting will start shortly," or something. I don't know what was going on.
All right, hit record now. Get that going. All right, everything is good to go. Appreciate the attendees' patience. I hope everybody is having a great evening. And for those of you that this is the first time you've ever tuned in, this is our first live episode of PCL's Forward Thinking podcast. The PCL stands for the Professional Collegiate League, of which I'm the CEO and co-founder. Wendell, who's one of our panelists this evening, is also our CMO. But we are looking forward to having a great discussion tonight on the lasting impact of 2020 and in particular the pandemic on the sports industry. So with me this evening, I have a panel I'm very excited about. We have Kavitha Davidson, who is host and editorial director of The Lead at The Athletic. Kelsey Trainer, who leads business and legal affairs at Abrams Media. And then we have Kylie Scales, who is the principal of Think Free Global Strategies and the former managing director of Black Lives Matter Global Network. And then, as I mentioned, Wendell Haskins, the PCL's CMO and also the former head of diversity and inclusion at the PGA of America, which we will definitely be getting into in this evening's discussion. As I mentioned, I'm Ricky Vellante, CEO and co-founder of the PCL, also a practicing attorney. And so we'll have a little bit of a legal flair this evening, but I want to give each of our panelists, starting with Kavitha, a chance to give a little bit more of a deep dive into who you are and what all you do.
Hi, well, I'm very happy to be here. I think Ricky and I first met at a South by Southwest panel that I did with he and his co-founder, Andy Schwartz, on labor issues in college sports, which was very appropriate. I have a background in sports business reporting. I started at Bloomberg as a columnist, sports columnist. I went to ESPN after that, and now I'm at The Athletic. I'm actually wrapping up my last week hosting The Lead, and I'm going to move over to launch our culture podcast and to go back to writing, to be our culture reporter, going back to some of the intersections of race and gender in sports that I cover a lot. Last year in September, my first book was published, Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back, co-written by the lovely and amazing Jessica Luther. And basically every chapter in our book deals with a different ethical dilemma of sports fandom and how we reconcile those things. And there's a whole chapter in there about the NCAA. So super excited to be here, and I'll kick it back to you, Ricky.
Yeah, and I'll also mention this, Kavitha. I was in the process of preparing my syllabus for my introduction to sports law class, and I found an old one from when I was in law school that actually had a number of your Bloomberg stories as required readings. So I had a good chuckle about that. All right, next up, we'll go with Kelsey.
Hey, Ricky, thank you for having me, and excited to meet everyone here on this podcast / panel. Kelsey Trainer, I am a lawyer in the media and entertainment space. I work on the reg in development and production, but I also dabble in sports, and I write and podcast and commentate on a lot of the issues, legal issues in the sports space, as well as work to advocate for women and women's sports. And so, I've come across all of you in a number of different ways. and just excited to be here to talk about all these things with you guys.
Awesome. Appreciate you joining as always, Kelsey. Next up, we have, we'll go with Kylie. Just keep it going in order.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation, to be in the company of such incredible people. I'm very honored to have this opportunity to talk about such an important topic. So thank you. My name is Kylie Scales. I am a social change agent, a strategist, and an organizational professional. And for the past 2 decades, I've worked in 14 countries and 5 continents, helping people to move forward their transformative work. So I've worked on a variety of progressive issues, including climate change, maternal health and family planning, drug abuse prevention, education inequity, and health inequity. Most recently, as you pointed out earlier, for the past few years, I worked as the managing director of Black Lives Matter Global Network, sitting in the leadership position of the most influential and largest social movement of our lifetime in recent history. And during that time, I helped build an infrastructure around this decentralized movement that was based in a grassroots way and built around organizers. And so I brought a suite of activities to the organization and structure and compliance, all of those really boring things, as well as expanding programming and creating what was recently our political social civic engagement campaign called What Matters 2020. I created that as well as some other activities for the movement. Right now, I am the principal and founder of Think Free Global Strategies, where I work with different companies, brands, individuals, organizations, and helping them to develop their transformative goals and infuse their values into their everyday work. Oftentimes doing activities like ensuring that the services and their products are market ready, etc. So that's me.
So just a few things you've done there.
Just a little bit.
All right. Next up, we have Wendell. Go ahead.
Man, these are some kick-ass women on this panel. Ricky, you must not like me very much to put me last in all of these incredible resumes, man. I'm like, that's these tough acts to follow. You guys have to excuse me a little bit. For some reason, I'm losing my voice today, so I'll keep it brief. My name is Wendell Haskins. I've worked in the sports and entertainment space for over 25 years. Started out really in the music business, working with Island Black music and Def Jam and artist development. And then I also did a lot of work with the National Basketball Association and working with player development. Started my own kind of consulting business around that time. So I was kind of a hired gun and a free agent to, help pretty much develop talent. I got into the golf space in the late 90s, started playing golf. I saw there was actually a void for of people of color in golf and inclusion in the game, and started doing a lot of things in that space entrepreneurially, dabbled between still sports, basketball, and golf. Skills continue to do those things for quite some time, led me to an opportunity at the PGA ultimately, where I headed the first diversity and inclusion department at the PGA of America, which was a first, helped develop all of the strategy and groundwork for the first diversity and inclusion program. Spent a little bit of time there. Then I met Ricky at the NBA All-Star Game, which I continue to be very involved with the NBA for a number of years and had a great relationship with them. I didn't grow up playing golf or anything like that, but basketball has always been my first passion. So I've always had a foot in basketball. I love what the PCL was about in terms of not only the diversity and inclusion kind of component of it, but the equity and education part. Been really working with the PCL for the last year, and really excited about the work we're doing and the change that we're really bringing to collegiate sports.
Yeah, interestingly, Wendell and I have been together in person exactly one time. Speaking of the impact of the pandemic on sports.
And Ricky was so impressive that I couldn't separate myself from him from that day forward.
The Richmond connection also helped, which, you know, sporting the flying squirrels tonight. So, so tonight throughout our discussion, just again, because this is the first time we've ever done a live discussion, there is the Q&A and the raise your hand tools that all the attendees can use. So if you have any questions as we go along, feel free to send them out, and I'll be sure to relay those to our panelists. So just wanted to throw that out before we dive in here. But we're going to be covering three main topics. We're going to be looking at the overall impact of the pandemic on sports and the sports industry, especially college sports. We're going to be looking at racial inequalities in the Black Lives Matter movement and its intersection with the sports industry. And finally, we're going to be wrapping up with investing in women's sports and the fight for equal rights within the sports industry. So should be a great discussion overall. And I'm going to actually kick this first one back over to Kavitha. So Kavitha, you have a little bit different of a lens than the rest of us in terms of our involvement within the sports industry as being a prominent member of the media and being at The Athletic. So how has the media's coverage of the pandemic and just the media industry in general changed throughout the pandemic?
Yeah, tomorrow is the 1-year anniversary of Rudy Gobert testing positive and everything coming to a crashing halt. I remember that day vividly. I mean, media has had to adapt in the last year, obviously without having any sports to cover. But I think it's also forced us to really look within ourselves about how we cover things, what we are covering, what we're choosing to cover, and what our responsibility as journalists is actually. Even before George Floyd was killed, we were being confronted with questions about what our perspectives are supposed to be, what is objectivity, are we responsible in covering whether sports should shut down at that point and then reopen in the middle of the summer? And how are our readers, our listeners, and our readers taking that information and digesting it? I think you saw a lot of backlash against reporters who were just doing straight reporting about what the science was saying at the time, about what local health officials were saying at the time, about what the president of the Big Ten was saying at the time, and people really needing to looking to the media for a distillation of information that frankly we didn't always have. So then when you move into the summer, the end of spring and the beginning of summer, and George Floyd was killed, and we then start to have all of these conversations about not only social justice and police brutality and racial justice, but in the lens of a pandemic, it was a perfect storm of all of these things coming together, and we really had to look within ourselves about what we were doing right and what we were doing wrong, and which readers we were and weren't serving. And I think that that's an ongoing discussion. That's obviously something media companies across the country are now dealing with. Companies of all stripes are now dealing with, and it's been a really interesting time to see, in an industry that has always been volatile and has in recent years certainly been unstable, what something like a pandemic and a major social movement could do to us. And I will also just add that as somebody who published a book in the middle of a pandemic about sports, questions about whether sports were relevant, whether sports were important, whether it was responsible to be talking about sports when there were literally people dying, were questions that we all had to be confronted with. And I think one of the things that surprised me about the last year is that not only did people want to talk about sports, but the pandemic really heightened, as it heightened in all other realms, inequality and issues and systemic problems that already existed. What the pandemic really heightened was all of these issues that have kind of been bubbling and kind of stayed at the surface in sports, that now we all had a platform and reason to talk about, frankly, without the distraction of the actual games.
Absolutely. And Kelsey, I know you've covered this extensively, and in fact, you wrote an article that I still make my classes read when it comes to the WNBA CBA. We happen to have like 3 CBAs that were negotiated right around the time of the beginning of the pandemic, and now we're in a world where league revenues have been incredibly impacted, and what sports looks like today versus what sports looked like a year ago today. How has all of that impacted the way that leagues and teams are operating in terms of revenue generation and their overall operations?
Yeah, I mean, we can go back to that WNBA groundbreaking collective bargaining agreement. And at the time, it was big news because there was a brand new 50-50 revenue split there, which hadn't been done before for the league and the players if they met certain market targets. That went out the window essentially, because I don't know how you meet a target in the market in COVID. And, while the WNBA and the NWSL and all the other women's sports leagues certainly came through, and I think we're really innovative in how to hold, sports in this time. It's been really difficult to generate that revenue. Sponsorships have had to kind of been folded over into the next year. Ticket sales are non-existent. So it's been really tough, especially in the women's sports space, where that revenue pays not just your players and your and the staff, everyone in the front office, et cetera, where you don't have that necessarily kind of pocket full of change that's kind of sitting there in reserve, like some of the men's sports leagues. So it was really difficult in terms of, these collective bargaining agreements existed. And like you said, there's 3 that I think were negotiated and renegotiated. We can get into a whole discussion on force majeure clauses. But, I think the end of the day, the strong CBA is in place, especially for the WNBA. They knew what they were doing there. They've held Major League Soccer is a whole different story. But it's been interesting to see how the revenue is able to get hit for all the different leagues.
Yeah, and I remember, now not to knock the media, sorry, Kavitha, but for a moment, there was a narrative that was growing around this time. Well, it took us a few weeks, but then there was a narrative growing around the idea that we needed to do everything we could to get back to normal, and people wanted this distraction. And in particular, that distraction, they wanted the NBA back. And, early days, we were thinking like, hey, just don't shake hands, and we could be around each other, but bump elbows, like stuff like that. So like we were wildly ignorant as to how COVID worked at the time.
Well,
but
I will just say that, I think a lot, like we were very split in the media about how to cover this, obviously, and still are. And again, the science was changing, the data was changing, recommendations from local municipalities were changing, but there was an aspect that directly related to women's sports. It's really hard to overstate how much panic those of us who have wanted to see women's sports succeed for so long had in that immediacy, seeing how much growth was made and how groundbreaking the CBA was. And then to not know if you would see any of the results from that, or if the W would get any kind of a fair shot, so I don't think, and frankly, the women's sports leagues, the NWSL was the first league back of all of the professional sports leagues, did a phenomenal job, were extremely responsible in the way that they did that. But I think there were a lot of us, even if we weren't writing about this publicly, that were privately thinking, man, like, what a time for women's sports to have to shut down. Like, we have to get to a point where it is safe to reopen sports because we want to see these leagues reap the benefits of this work that they've done.
Absolutely. And the NWSL, not so much, but then you have the WNBA and the NBA who people wanted back. You have football, you have college football, who people wanted to see the show go on. And it just so happens that when you look at the racial demographics of these leagues, you're talking about leagues that are predominantly Black players, again, at a time where we didn't really know how to appropriately go about these safety protocols. So Kylie, in your work with BLM and just all the incredible work you've done in general, how does that sit for you when there was this expectation that primarily Black players needed to put themselves at risk so that people could feel better at home watching sports and having a distraction?
Yeah, I think that there's a few things that I think the pandemic and the intersection between the pandemic and the social justice movement has kind of kicked up over the past year. Number one, as everyone, as all of the panelists have said, it was all a very odd time, right? So no one knew what to do. No one knew whether or not they should be playing or not playing, and then compounding the isolation that we were all experiencing, we started to become more aware of all of these challenges that a lot of us have known for many, many years, but some of us were just starting to become aware of some of the racial unrest that was happening in our communities as well. So we were stuck in this place of wanting to forget everything and live in the fantasy and be, distracted by the joy of watching our favorite sports and, thinking about putting our players at risk and trying to figure that out, and also wanting to respond to all of the other things that were happening in the world. And I think that by isolating, many folks, including sports figures, had the opportunity to really dig a little bit deeper and think a little bit more clearly about what was happening in their communities, how it reflected on them, how it reflected on their safety in response to a pandemic, how it impacted their safety in response to being among the racially marginalized in this country. And so it kind of all came to a head all at the same time. And I know you probably want to go a little bit deeper down that rabbit hole, if you will. But, I think that it was just a very unsettling, confusing, and in ways illuminating time for both players and sports enthusiasts.
Absolutely. And we definitely will be getting into that at a much more granular level here soon. So to continue going around the horn here. So Wendell, you, as we alluded to already, you joined the PCL right as the pandemic started. I think the announcement that you joined us was either the last week before the pandemic or the first week of the pandemic, something like that. But to now we're over a year into, or we're about a year into this. We've seen an entire college football season and a college basketball season. We've seen tests, we've seen positive case, we've seen teams like LSU who have a 97% positive rate on their football team. What for you has been, how has the curtain been pulled back on the college sports industry? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, well, the last time I traveled, Ricky, was in Chicago when I saw you, and obviously we could see from in college sports, there was still this expectation that these college players should go out and play, regardless of kind of what was going on in the world, the pandemic, and that these college players should, essentially take the risk to go back to school and play, even when their schools and universities were essentially closed to the regular student population. So it really just showed how reliant these schools are on these athletes to play and to generate revenue, right? Essentially, the desire for them to play is because college athletics generates so much revenue for the schools, right? And they have TV contracts and advertising contracts and things that they want to fulfill that they don't want to jeopardize. So it wasn't just purely for entertainment purposes, it was to keep the money flowing, right? So it really kind of pulled back the curtain to show just how reliant these big schools are on their TV contracts, and predominantly, and we're talking about, predominantly Black players when it kind of comes to football and basketball per se. So, when we talk about the philosophy of the PCL, it even became more apparent to me and to us, how, these college players are essential to the revenue generations of their schools and universities, and take on a lot of risks without being compensated per se. Just in terms of scholarships, yes, but in terms of, being paid athletes, this would be something that you might expect for the professional workforce, but at the collegiate level, not so much. So it really pulled back the curtain for us to really for it to be even more exposed how these athletes are relatively being exploited.
Absolutely. And Kelsey, I know that we've discussed this before, you previously worked in the insurance space. When you have athletes that are not employees who are being required or pseudo being required to come back and play, putting on your lawyer hat for a moment, what sort of concerns do you have on a forward-looking basis down the road, especially if we have athletes that have, long-standing impacts as a result of having contracted COVID playing college sports?
Yeah, I mean, who wants to talk about the law? No, I'm just kidding. Listen, at the end of the day, the NCAA itself is unpaid labor. So that's, as a lawyer, that's a really difficult kind of thing to wrap your head around. I will say that from my perspective, the legal perspective, everything having to do with all the protocols and the policies for having sports come back didn't have to do with keeping players, athletes, coaches, staff safe. It had to do with not getting sued, right? They wanted to make sure that they had policy A, B, C, D in place, that, it was either certain levels of testing, certain, limits of who could be where. They needed to have those things in place so that if somebody did get COVID or, really, really sick or end up having these horrible complications and dying, that they wouldn't get sued. So it wasn't about, keeping the players safe, everything that was put in place. It was about not getting sued for millions and millions of dollars. So obviously down the road and forward looking, we've obviously seen a number of players that sat out the collegiate basketball season, I believe football as well, and other sports with heart conditions as a result of having COVID. And so I think we are going to see, we don't know what the breadth and the scope of these lawsuits are going to look like. But, as I think, my favorite Jay Billis says is there will be lawyers. And that's going to be something down the road that unfortunately, and it's not something that I wish to see, but there's going to be players and coaches and staff who have, really bad complications from contracting COVID in certain environments. And we don't know what the courts are going to do with it. We don't know if the courts are going to say, well, they had ABCD policy in place and therefore, they met the standard of care and, there's no damages for you. Or, if the people are going to eventually be held responsible for, not necessarily putting player and staff safety first.
And if I can just say also, I think this is really an example of a historic legacy that we see of us as a society, as the United States, really putting an undue burden on a certain population of people in order to present and provide entertainment, labor, whatever it is, in order for us, for this country to function. And so, what I see here is sort of a continuation of that. And we'll talk about more, again, about the dust that this kicked up and how people are addressing some of that. But I think it's an important conversation to have in terms of who is responsible for what in this country, who is responsible for providing what things in this country, and who is kept safe and secure while others are often put at risk. So I just, we'll talk more about that, but I just want to point out the historical legacy.
Well, just to that end, I mean, there are a couple of polls that I always point to when I'm talking about this, even before the pandemic, when we just talk about the idea of the exploitation of labor and of mostly Black labor in the NCAA, if you look at any poll, then the numbers have been changing in the last couple of years, which is encouraging. But especially, let's say 5 years ago, if you polled people about whether they thought college athletes deserved to be paid or compensated in some way, overwhelmingly, white respondents said no, and Black respondents said yes. And that just kind of tells you who is actually providing that labor and who feels entitled to that labor for free. And now there have been similar polls about whether college sports, whether all sports, but whether college sports in particular should reopen and should have reopened. And again, you still see those same dividing lines. And what this pandemic has done is not only show us where those inequities exist, but also also who our more vulnerable populations are, to Kylie's point. And going beyond college, the fact that once these athletes when they do become pro at an extremely small clip, obviously, but when they do, they don't just stop being Black men and women in America. Karl Anthony Towns lost a bunch of members of his family, and the fact that he was a millionaire, basketball player didn't mean that he wasn't any less vulnerable to this virus. So I think all of those are considerations that we need to have, and who, to Kylie's point, is expecting these players to just go back and play.
Absolutely. And I think y'all are the stars of tonight, not me. So I'm going to keep most of my amateurism as a con shtick to myself. But certainly, if you trace the roots and history of amateurism, at least as a concept in the United States, it's been used as a weapon, essentially, to economically hold back primarily Black athletes. We can all regale ourselves in the concept and ideals of amateurism, but the Greeks didn't do it in the Olympics, and we shouldn't be doing it today. But anyway, so putting a pin in that for a moment, actually, Kavitha, coming back to you, in terms of the coverage that you've done in the business of sports, how have you seen shifts in terms of leagues and teams now looking less so at physical event-based, arena-based revenues and shifting more to a digital focus going forward?
I mean, I think that what we've seen in the last year is just a continuation of what was already happening. Most leagues weren't deriving their primary revenue source from gate receipts or in stadium concessions. It is a big part of their revenue, but TV deals is really just where most of that money comes from. Now, obviously, if there aren't games on, then that throws your TV deals into limbo. But what we've also seen are, and I think we've seen this throughout industries, not just in sports, leagues and teams using the pandemic as an excuse to make cuts or cry poor or make changes that they already wanted to do. And now they had cover and a global pandemic as an excuse for doing those things. I mean, we immediately heard over the summer how much money some of these teams claim to lose. If their books aren't open, there's really no way to verify that, frankly. And if these teams and leagues are trying to use the idea that they've lost so much revenue in the last year that then they have to deny their players, their workers, the proper share of their wages under their collective bargaining agreements, again, there's no way to verify that. So I do think that, I'm an extremely cynical person. I think that one thing that we don't do well as Americans in general is prioritize labor over management. And when it comes to sports, those dynamics are even more heightened, because when we're talking about labor in pro sports, we are talking about millionaires. But when we're talking about management, we're talking about billionaires. And we're talking about people who are making hundreds of times of profit over the people who are making millions of dollars. And fans have a really difficult time seeing these players as workers, but that's who they are. So what we have seen with some of the issues of revenue in the last year is, yes, I mean, obviously when you don't have sports on, you're going to lose some money. You should these leagues do and should have some kind of contingency plan in place for a down year. And frankly, they do. And we've heard all kinds of things about how much money the NFL was standing to lose. Everyone was bracing for the salary cap to significantly diminish, because that's a function of revenue. And salary cap for the NFL next year is going to be basically what it was this year. So they really didn't see as many losses. And this idea that sports are in some way a perpetual motion machine when it comes to making money was kind of borne out. So whenever those arguments are used to suppress wages or to suppress labor rights, I think we all really need to question those things.
Wendell, did you mean to raise your hand? Did you have something? You're muted again.
It's also kind of a historical fact that, none of these industries tend to, change the way they do business, and they're generally in denial until there's some kind of radical disruption. When I worked in the music business, we were still selling CDs, and then along came Napster, and all of people were music sharing, and it was like this will never work. We got to sue this guy. We have to shut Napster down. he's stealing, stealing content. This is stealing music, and the music business essentially had to change the way that they did business and adapt to the digital age. And the same thing goes for print publications. At one time you would have never thought that you wouldn't buy a hard copy magazine again, and issues that we know that traditionally were this, they went to this, to this, to this, and all of their advertising dollars were shifted to digital. And we're seeing kind of the same things in sports. I mean, this has been a radical disruption, and the way that the sports business probably thought they would never have to do business, we're seeing them adapt, just like the music business had to change to digital and sharing music, and figure out a whole new revenue model that kind of eliminated having to actually go and purchase a cassette or CD or an album. And there goes Tower Records, there goes going and renting VHS tapes and things of that nature. Pretty much changed the whole way that we consume content. And this is pretty much what's happening in the sports space right now. And we're really shifting to more of a digital footprint. We're streaming content, not being so reliant on fans being in the stadiums and arenas. I mean, hopefully we'll get back to that, but certainly the entire industry has had to shift on, how will we adjust for this? And to Kavitha's point, if this ever happens again, how will we be prepared for it?
To that, I mean, like the way that I always put this is, sports in particular are an industry built on inertia. Things have always worked a certain way. These leagues continually balloon in their revenues year to year. So why change the way that we do things? And this is an argument that's been that I constantly make when you're arguing for investment in women's sports. This is an argument that you can see in MLB not catering to Black or young fans until recent years, because they've had to, because they realize having a fan base that is predominantly 55 and over and white isn't going to serve you 20 years down the line. So what this pandemic has done, to Wendell's point, is force these changes, again, of leagues that are still making money hand over fist, but force these changes because they have to look to the future and they have to look to where their shortcomings are. And when you're pivoting to digital and when you're building a strategy around digital, primarily the consumers of digital media are people of color and young. So you have to completely overhaul your strategies of marketing your sports and of marketing your games and your athletes, and of the way that you talk about your athletes as well, to cater to those audience. And just on the last point of what do we do if this happens again, I'd actually be really interested to hear Kelsey's thought on this, because as the sports business reporter, the most fascinating thing that I saw in the last year was the fact that Wimbledon and the British Open golf tournament didn't lose any money because those organizing bodies had full pandemic insurance. And is that just like an American thing, that we don't believe in insurance enough, that our leagues didn't have that? Because we did kind of go through this with H1N1. We've been through other pandemics to a smaller scale. But all of these leagues suddenly panicking, except for the Brits over there, I think we've got some questions to ask.
Well, Ricky might agree with me here, but I think it's pretty clear that America in general didn't really think much of a global pandemic happening, and so I think that that's reflective of people and getting insurance. Having worked in the insurance industry, and then I've also worked on the other side in media and needing to get that insurance, you obviously want to spend the least amount of money that you have to for something that is cost benefit of it actually happening is fairly low. So some people gambled on that. I would say the Brits gambled and won in those cases. But yeah, that's definitely not something in your risk assessment that you're going for in terms of insurance and looking through those policies. That you're not even actually checking to see if global pandemic is covered. to be quite honest, in the force majeure clause, there's so many other things that are more likely to happen that you're looking to just make sure that they're in there, and global pandemic is not one of them.
And look, well, joke's on us.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, and so a point that Kavitha made that actually is going to segue us into the next topic here. And Kylie, I want to start off with you. But Kavitha mentioned the dynamics as far as fans perceiving labor versus management. And again, looking at the racial demographics of, we don't have a non-white owner in the NFL. And I think we only have 2 or 3 in the NBA, one of whom is Michael Jordan. So in that sense, is that part of what's driving just the lack of recognition, or maybe the lack of the ability to relate to the talent on the field as far as how fans are perceiving that battle between millionaires and billionaires?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is reflective across many different sectors, across, within this country, within the world. And it's truly lack of representation at the executive level, right? Without representation, without a strong voice, without an association of what's happening to people everywhere of all different types of backgrounds, there's no advocacy. There's no one who's going to stand up for and support people who experience things that they do not experience. And what you'll find is this wholly managerial labor, divide, because there are people that are interested in serving their own or people just like them's best interests. I often say that, we as a society are experiencing, fighting and this sort of caste system to protect a very small group of people. And many of us are tricked into participating because we're thrown the breadcrumbs of what that is, and the divide of the breadcrumbs gets smaller the further you are away from management, as when you are a laborer, when you're a performer, when you're a work for hire. And so what we are seeing right now is this lack of representation ripple into the disparate outcomes for everybody else. And so, we have to start there. And that's what a lot of this has kicked up, right? So we are seeing a lot of voices talking about that. We're hearing a lot of people saying, where's our representation at the executive level? Who is serving our best interests? We're seeing that in government. This is a representative government, yet 11% of Senate people, Senate members are Black. I mean, it's outrageous. And so we have to start really deliberately thinking about how we're going to diversify and be represented in all of those spaces and places, because right now it's very uneven and it feels very obvious that the ones that are delivering are of color and the ones that are making decisions that impact those people are not. And it's quite obvious. So what we need to start doing, what we need to start pushing for and encouraging are those people who are in those positions to stand up and give up their seat. Oftentimes we're like, but there's not enough people and there's no one around, and who are we gonna, oh gosh, there's just so much lack of people that can fulfill these roles. Either we create new spaces or we ask people to give their seat up. That's the only way this is going to work. But it has to be something that we continuously demand if we are to put all of our faith and our health and our ability to thrive in the hands of others. That doesn't sit well with me. It doesn't sit well with a lot of people. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is the changing perspective and more people advocating for their self-interest.
And Wendell, that brings me to you. At the end of last summer, you penned an open letter to the PGA of America around your experiences at the PGA of America. Obviously, it's a sport that is incredibly white historically. And I think you gave me some crazy number that like 0.5% of all members of the PGA of America are not white, something very, very low like that. But so you were in a prominent sports organization, as far as I remember, you were the only non-white executive. So take us through both your open letter and your personal experiences in that setting.
Yeah, well, I went to the PGA, having a history of, having created a space for people of color, particularly on my own, entrepreneurially. So I never had to answer to anyone. I did the things that I thought were natural and organic and really meaningful to Black culture. I'd started my own tournament and small brand called the Original Tee Golf Classic that celebrated the history of African Americans in golf. It was very well supported and popular in sports and entertainment spaces. The NBA had actually been a sponsor and still is to this day for the 22 years that the tournament has existed. I've had sponsors like Mercedes-Benz, BMW, American Express. So, I built something that was really special and, was plugged by the by the PGA to come do everything that I was doing under the PGA umbrella, because supposedly they were impressed by what I'd created and what I'd done, and I could bring value to the PGA of America. When I got there, it was kind of a different story. It was a really homogenous workforce. I was the only, senior Black person in senior leadership, so to speak. So, I was largely dealing with people of, stuck in the traditional way of doing things, having to explain things that were meaningful to me and to the culture that they just did not grasp, understand, or quite frankly care about. So, there was resistance there for me being able to make certain progress, and it was extremely difficult. When there were things that I was able to accomplish that were huge, getting Charlie Sifford the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which I actually, was able to do from my vast array of relationships and getting people to write letters to President Obama. So everyone from Jim Brown, Alonzo Mourning, Ken Chenault from American Express. A really impressive list of people that I was able to get that done and quite frankly make history. This was my first year at the company. And, I went to DC to celebrate with Charlie Sifford, obviously, and went to the White House. And unfortunately, it was very revealing that, none of my senior leadership even came to recognize this man who was the Jackie Robinson of golf, And so that was a real eye opener for me, because I kind of said, if this doesn't mean anything in terms of advancements in building relationships with people of color, I might not ever do anything that's bigger than this, and having so few people in the golf space other than Tiger Woods that were, even playing golf professionally, it was going to be extremely difficult to create, events and occasions that would bring people together on such a large scale. And, and having gotten, key leaders from, and not just people of color. Arnold Palmer wrote a letter, Jack Nicklaus. What an opportunity to bring communities together of something meaningful, to celebrate Charlie Sifford, but also to use this as a transitional point of moving golf forward and building relationships with Black communities. And it was just a huge missed opportunity. I was able to do a number of other things, bringing Steph Curry to the PGA of America was a key. When I first suggested that, people didn't even really know that Steph Curry was a golfer, and they're kind of looking at me like, why this guy? But at the time, the ambassadors for our junior league golf program were Rory McIlroy, Ricky Fowler, Michelle Wie, and Lexi Thompson, right? Tiger Woods is not going to be a golf ambassador for the PGA of America. So I said, wow, let's go outside of golf. And what greater ambassador than a guy like Steph Curry, who grew up playing golf and basketball, attracts, obviously attracts Black kids because he's a huge superstar in the NBA. And why not do that? I was able to get Steph interested. And when it came down to it, the person that I reported to at the time made me cancel my meeting with Curry, and then went back and took the meeting for himself. And then, post George Floyd, it was even more shocking and kind of another stab that the PGA took a long time to even make us. And when they finally did, they released a letter from the PGA of America. And the photo that they used to support racial injustice was the CEO and the CEO of the PGA of America and the president with Steph Curry. So something that was didn't seem so important at one time when it finally came to fruition, and when they were able to use it, to their for their best use in the moment, they used something that was my work that to me actually reflected the terrible marginalization of a Black executive. Because obviously I wasn't present in the photo, and so there were a lot of things that I experienced there that were extremely disappointing, and it caused me to pen an open letter particularly after that photo was released. And you know, and I just talked about all of my experiences, the many microaggressions that I experienced while I was at the PGA of America, the resistance that I received from some of my employees, the pernicious behavior to either discredit me or marginalize me. And it was, you know, it was extremely disappointing because I was really bringing some high level resources, great ideas, and new opportunities. So just a hugely missed opportunity for golf.
Wendell, can I ask, what years were you at the PGA of America?
From 2014 through 2017. So 4 years, 2014 up to just about 2018.
Okay, so because one thing that you said, I think, is something that we're seeing throughout sports, we're seeing throughout every industry, but I'll start by saying in 2019, before I moved over to my current role, hosting my podcast, I was covering sports business for The Athletic, and two executives from the PGA of America sent me a note. One was a person of color, the other one was not, but they were basically in the D&I department there. Or they were heading a D&I initiative, and they wanted to meet with me. We had coffee to talk about, you know, the tournament that they were putting on in the Bronx and the tournament that they were putting on in Jersey City, and how they knew that they needed to tap into Black and Latino fans that were not watching their sport because they weren't making money. I think that's something that we're seeing across sports and across all industries, like I said before, is that diversity only matters as it moves the bottom line. And frankly, that's fine with me. Like, I kind of don't care if you have your come to Jesus moment, but if what gets you to care about diversity is that it's going to make you more money, but that actually does get you to care about diversity, then I think that's a good thing. But you can say that you care about diversity because it's going to move your bottom line. And again, like the World Economic Forum and Deloitte every single year put out these reports that say diversity is good for revenue. But it's one thing to say that you care about diversity for that reason. And it's another thing to actually have systems in place and have hiring practices in place to be able to make that happen. So the fact that you were the only person of color, the only Black person at a senior level executive position to try and fix this league-wide problem says a lot, right? And it says a lot about what they think, the work that they actually think it takes to fix something that is so systemic and that does need a lot more buy-in from the people who are already there. I keep going back to these reports, but the way that you make that argument is it's not just diversity in who your fans are, but it's got to start with diversity in who is working for your company or who is working for your league, because you are not going to be able to change these practices if you don't have people with broader perspectives and with broader ideas of how to reach these demographics working for you.
Yeah. And if I could just respond to that and just build on that a little bit. So in the aftermath of George Floyd, I saw, as you can imagine, sitting, where in my seat at Black Lives Matter, I was inundated and had the opportunity to have conversations with NASCAR and the Tennis Association, all of these different groups, NBA, NFL, trying to figure out what their intervention was going to be and how they were going to respond. Some did display, as everyone has articulated, this business case. NASCAR in particular went very deep in that, and the work that Bubba Wallace did, and, just making it very clear that and removing the Confederate flag, and really just making it clear that the motivation for that was to engage a more diverse group of people. And I always challenged that thought process. I always, in all of these conversations, all these meetings, I always challenged the window dressing aspect of it. I always challenged the fact that communities of color are not fools. They're not people who are just gonna be like, oh, great, they took the flag down. Let me just join. Oh, this is amazing. Like, how great. It doesn't work that way. And so I always challenged these executives who I was on the phone with, like a slew of non-diverse men, Caucasian men who I would talk to, day in, day out, that if your work doesn't ripple down to the community, if your work doesn't impact the next Bubba Wallace, doesn't impact the next, all of these people that I could name, it doesn't mean anything. And people of color are not pawns to be played with, are not going to be enthused and convinced that you've turned over a new leaf because you removed a flag. I mean, it's ludicrous, quite frankly. And so one thing that I've been thinking about is, you know, we are represented in other places, like this illustrious group of people, even on this panel, we have journalists, you know, like people of color. I'd love to see more solutions being pushed out into conversations in the media, in business writings. Like, can we start talking about real solutions and present and demanding those and saying, well, why don't you do this, NASCAR? Why don't you set up a scholarship? Why don't you engage more people? Why is Bubba Wallace the only full-time Black, you know, driver? You know, where does it start? How do we need specific solutions and specific activities that will purposefully include more people? And here's some thoughts. And, you know, perhaps if we can put some pressure, and, you know, I know a lot about putting pressure, if we start putting some pressure on people and start holding people accountable to real, you know, specific solutions, I won't have to sit and listen to a whole bunch of people pontificating about whether or not they should put a slain person's name on a chair, you know, in a stadium, and we've done it and good and seen, you know what I mean? Like it's getting a little bit, and we're seeing right in this moment are people like, I put the name on the chair. We good, we done. And so, and yet the systemic issues remain, and yet nothing has changed. And yet our players are still marginalized, our people are still impacted, our communities are still ignored, our owners and our executives are richer than ever. So anyway, that's all. I'm done.
Yeah, no, you're you're exactly correct, Kylie. And to Wendell's credit, in his open letter, he did have like, here are action items that the PGA of America can do to address some of these situations now that I'm no longer there.
And not just Wendell, it's not his job. It's,
all right.
You know what I mean?
No, absolutely, and I agree with you, Kylie. And out of all of the things, to further your point, Kylie, of all of the things that I suggested, there may have been like 16 things that I suggested that ran the gamut from, you know, revenue generating things to historical things to the one thing that they did was that I said was to change the name of some award because the guy was racist. That's the one thing that they did. And they're still getting backlash to this day of people. Now, this is a guy from the 1950s that the PGA has had an award for, named after him, you know, since 1950, whatever. And still to this day, people are defending that man. You know, people are calling, yeah, that man was not a racist. That man, but that's the one thing that within 2 weeks, they changed the name of the Horton Smith Award. And, you know, and I'm like, that was the least, out of all of the things on that list, that was the least that you could have done. And that's the one that's exactly what you chose, to change the name of some award.
Coincidentally.
Right.
Yeah. And so, I mean, in what was already, I guess incredible is maybe the right word or maybe the wrong word, an incredible summer in terms of what we as a society were experiencing. Kylie, you've already alluded to it. There was the killing of George Floyd, and we have the shooting of Jacob Blake, and the NBA players actually decide to not play a game, to call off a week or a weekend. It ended up being once Adam ends up reacting. I will relay before I pose the question here. I happen to be on the phone with our Wendell and I's business partner, David West, who played in the NBA for 15 or 17 years. I forget which now. We were on the phone. I told him before he saw it on the news, and I won't repeat his exact words, but it was basically like, holy crap, I never would have thought this would happen. Like, it didn't happen around Donald Sterling. I didn't think it would happen now. So I'm going to start with Kelsey here, because this is going to kind of take us into the last topic of the evening, because I do want to be respectful of the panelists' time. Obviously, the movement within the NBA and the support of the Black Lives Matter movement were incredibly impactful. But then there was the WNBA, which was putting it all on the line for such a long period of time, even before players in the NBA were doing so. We end up, now that the dust has settled, the Atlanta Dream are sold we have Senator Warnock is elected, Georgia turns blue, and all of it really did start with the Atlanta Dream. So I guess there's not really a question there.
Yeah, no. I mean, listen, I think that we all, anybody who is in the women's sports space, if you don't know, the WNBA has been doing it since the beginning, right? Maya Moore, Simone Augustus, the Minnesota Lynx, they were kneeling for the national anthem before Colin Kaepernick was, right? They actually had their police security walk out of the arena after they did that. So the WNBA has been doing it. Why? I would suggest it's because they are a league of predominantly Black women, and they understand everything that is going on in society. And as always, Black women do everything and are tasked to basically save everything. And so, the WNBA, and so you go back to the Minnesota Lynx, and then you have the Atlanta Dream and Kelly Loeffler. And that whole thing, Kelly Loeffler put her letter out, basically, condoning everything that the WNBA was doing at the time, kneeling, Black Lives Matter, everything. And you have Renee Montgomery, who actually is now an owner. She was a player, and now she's an owner of the new ownership group for the Atlanta Dream. But if you look too, I mean, their strategy there, the players were. They were calling her out at first. And I think that I know Sue Bird gets a lot of credit, but there was so much going on at the time that they were down in the wubble, that the Black women were already dealing with so much. And Sue literally said, I'll do this one thing. I'll get these T-shirts made that basically said vote Warnock. And they stopped saying Kelly Loeffler's name. They stopped tweeting about her. They stopped, mentioning her, bringing her up in subjects. Sat down with Senator Warnock and really got to know him and what he was about. And they did the work, and they changed the course of history. And, I actually sent Sue a message and Renee a message the day that Georgia turned blue. And I was like, I don't know what it means coming from me, but it's absolutely insane to see what the women of the WNBA have done. They have, it's not to say that they alone did that, because obviously there have been people putting in the work for so long, especially in Georgia. But it was part of the tide turning. I mean, the poll numbers absolutely show Warnock's numbers going from such, single digits to, way higher. And so it just cannot be kind of, it can't be said enough that the women of the WNBA have been doing it. They will continue to do it, and the men of the men of the NBA know it too, right? They give them all of their props and their respect. LeBron James just in a press conference was talking about Renee Montgomery and what the Atlanta Dream and all those women do. So that's kind of just a little background and history of it all, but they've been doing it.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, like the women in this space who have been doing it never get the credit until men amplify this message, right? I mean, as Kelsey said, the Minnesota Lynx were kneeling in 2017 before Colin Kaepernick was. Serena Williams has been talking about these issues on an individual basis before even LeBron was. Serena's also talking about things like, the inequality in medicine toward Black women in America versus others. And this is a conversation that's now happening around mental health and with Meghan Markle and everything. And nobody paid attention until the men kind of jumped on that ship. But also to Kelsey's point, the men also recognize that these women have laid the blueprint. What the WNBA players did in the last year that they had also been doing in the last several years was they really turned athlete activism into organizing. They were really, really good at making that shift and of turning this into action. And what we saw with the Milwaukee Bucks when they staged their Wildcat strike or their walkout on the day that Jacob Blake was shot was they didn't just make a statement. They didn't just, walk off the court and sit in their locker room. They literally said, what can we do to enact change? And they got on the phone with the lieutenant governor of Wisconsin and said, what can we do? And they came out with a statement that basically said, we will not go back to playing until the state legislature comes back into session and votes on a police brutality bill that had been introduced months before. And they forced them to do that. So what we saw from these women was literally laying the blueprint of how these athletes not only could use their platforms, but could actually create tangible change with what they were doing there. It's just been incredible to see.
And to go back to a point that you made earlier, Kavitha, this was all at a very precarious time for the WNBA. To think that simultaneously, while you're getting a new CBA, dealing with a pandemic, you're going to do this strategic jiu-jitsu, which was incredible on the part of the Dream to stop using Loeffler's name in any way, shape, or form. But you're actually going to do something that might create this instability across the entire league and force the potential sale of the team. So again, like, props to them for just killing it there.
I mean, there's also, there are two ways to look at the way that WNBA players have been activists and have used their platforms. One is they don't have as much to lose as the men because, you know, they don't have as many sponsorship deals. They don't have, there's not as much money at play, right? They can be more outspoken. They don't have as high a business stake in this. The other way to look at that is they don't have as much of a safety net, obviously. If these players lose the sponsorships that they have, if they lose their season and don't have their salaries, they haven't made millions of dollars to fall back on. But the thing that I always say about why WNBA players, why female athletes, but especially Black female athletes are so good at this. Obviously, the whole history of our country is based off of Black women doing this work, but the very act of being a female athlete and being a Black woman athlete is a radical act in itself. So challenging systems and authority is inherent in what these women do for a living, and inherent in what, you know, they've been just fighting for the rights to do. So it's a kind of natural extension that they would be extremely good at the activist space in politics because they're already activists in sports.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So also in terms of just wrapping up sort of the juxtaposition here between BLM and investing in women's sports, we also had, you know, BLM very prominently displayed in the Premier League. We have still to this day pregame kneeling that's taking place. It's more a voluntary thing now, but was mandatory at the beginning. Kylie, did you, in all of the conversations that you were having, did you see any real genuine strives to not just deal with this in the moment and make it seem like they were doing the right thing, but to actually cause long-term change?
Honestly, I saw a lot of overall confusion. I think there was a lot of people who were concerned about really having a big and deep impact and what that could mean. I think that what we saw, like the NFL's response to Colin Kaepernick was very, set a tone for a lot of people. I know that, you know, we were just talking about the WNBA and the work that they've been doing since 2016 and beyond and before that, and how under the radar a lot of that fell. And I think that people were just concerned about, you know, what it would mean. I had conversations, people were asking things like, is it our place to really have these conversations and point it out? And are we supposed to make people sad? And, you know, folks were really trying to figure out what the intervention was. I didn't see a lot of conversation bubble up to the systemic piece. I know I push that envelope often during my conversations, and just again set out my list of strong recommendations about diversification from the top level. I think that, so from the conversations that I was having, which was more primarily business driven and executive driven, there was a good deal of apprehension around doing too much, saying too much, alienating people. I think it had to do with the political climate that we were all in and the polarization of America and, you know, and the world. And, you know, while there was this desire based on seeing, you know, millions of people into the streets and answering that call, there was a lot of apprehension. There were also a lot of trauma behaviors from having to witness a lot of what we've been witnessing, not just the pandemic, but obviously the murders of people in a very short succession having to witness the very brutal and human murder of George Floyd. So we saw a lot of stress behaviors, and people just didn't know what to do. And, they were sort of at this place of almost paralysis and trying to determine what activities were happening. Conversely, however, when I would have conversations with players, or when I would have conversations with people who'd been quarantined for so long and had this time to be introspective and had this time to really think about, their own lives, it was different. Right. So I would have these conversations with players who are like, people see me as this millionaire, as this person who does all these things, but nobody cares about that when I'm speeding. Nobody cares about that when I'm driving a nice car in my neighborhood and I go home to visit my family. And, I'm afraid I could have been George Floyd. I could be any of these people. And so I saw this real, movement towards activism from players and from that community. People were asking, where are the marches? Where can I go? How can I be plugged in? People were wondering, I mentioned my conversation with Bubba Wallace, and he was really about like, put the hashtag on the car. I don't really care what happens kind of thing, because that's the right thing to do. And we have to utilize our platform. So there was this shift in players really thinking about how they can use their I think a combination of, this could have been me, and nobody knows that, and nobody respects that, and nobody understands that, as I do and my family does. And I do have a platform, and I'm not doing anything right now. So I'm going to use that platform to save my life, to save other lives, to save my children's lives, to save my family members' lives. And so I just find, again, harking back to the earlier conversation between how we prioritize management over laborers, and how we as a society view labor versus how we see management. And it's just that juxtaposition between this moment, in this moment, and how the management folks were just like, wait, I don't, real skittish, and really didn't want to talk about those systemic issues that led us to this point. And then those laborers, those people on the ground, those people that are actually doing this work, those people that are experiencing these disparate outcomes, really saying, I'm willing to put it on the line. I'm willing to compromise all of it in order to save my life and the life of my peers and the life of my colleagues and the life of my family members and children. So, it was just a very interesting time that I witnessed. And I still see that right now. I see that mentality continue.
Yeah, well, I would love to have this conversation go all night. But again, out of respect for our panelists' time, we're going to go around the room here for last thoughts, just for a couple minutes each, or minute each, whatever. Kelsey, I think you have to run first. So we're going to start with you. The investment that we've seen in the women's sports world, and not just that, but the success we've seen. The NWSL and the WNBA have had huge surges in terms of not just viewership, but merchandise sales and overall interest in the product. So if maybe you could leave us with some thoughts there, and what we hopefully will see in terms of continued growth going forward.
Yeah, listen, I always say it's bad business to not be in the women's sports business. And what I mean by that is that it's absolutely wild, and I'm saying this facetiously, what you can do when you invest and cover a very good product. And that's what women's sports is. The product is excellent. You think of the WNBA, you think of women's soccer, especially the our players here in the United States. They're the best in the world. We have the product, it's there. I think you're starting to see people understand that I think like Kavitha was saying, that it's actually really good business to market your products, or kind of even put women's sports on TV. It's smart to do that, because the stats are out there in terms of who are women's sports fans, who's watching this. Women themselves hold the power to consume in this country. So if you want to make money, you should be in the women's sports space, because right now you can get in decently cheap. But then you have people who are starting to step up. You have Angel City, and what they've done, and Serena Williams and Julie Ehrman and Karen Nortman, and getting that money in there and the investment. And I think their new deal with DoorDash for their front of jersey sponsor is groundbreaking. They're up there in the millions, multi-million-dollar deal to get a front of jersey sponsor, which you didn't see before. But it's basically having powerful women in charge. And I think that's also kind of the answer. And again, the women's sports leagues are, they still have a ton of work to do. The NWSL has, I think 2 women GMs right now, no Black women GMs, no Black women female coaches. And the same with the WNBA. I mean, you have a league of predominantly Black women, and you have, I think there's 4 right now head coaches in the WNBA that are Black women. So the women's sports day still has a lot to do, but I think that you also see that what they are doing is working to an extent of investment and coverage. And I think, going forward, I think this pandemic was an absolutely horrible time, but at the same time, people were home and they were consuming media in a way that we've never seen before. And so they were able to watch women's sports because, they were the first leagues back. And so I think that now, given that, I think that hopefully networks, hopefully, sponsors understand and see the value of the product there, and they can get a lot for a little at this point. And they're going to keep diving in. And that's, at the end of the day, that's what it's about. For women everywhere, it's about capital. It's about having money and having people with that money, the correct people with that money to do the right things with it. So I'm optimistic, but cautiously.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And Wendell had to drop. Unfortunately, his little one was calling. Kavitha, final thoughts on your end. And also for our audience, please let them know where they can find your great book.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we try to steer everyone to independent booksellers. So it's wherever you can buy books. It is also on, Amazon and the major platforms. And yeah. I mean, I agree with everything that Kelsey said. I think that one of the exciting things that we've seen is because women's sports is so nascent in what it can be in the business side of things, excuse me, there's also so much more room to be disruptive and to try new things. Like the NWSL came back as the first professional sports league on CBS All Access and on streaming platforms. And we saw bonkers numbers that they were doing on those platforms. The NWSL has a sponsorship deal with a CBD company, which is also something that we wouldn't see in a very kind of staid, more buttoned up, established league. So I think that, we start to see where these things can go. And the only way to go is up. Like the only way to think of women's sports is as a growth industry, because if 4% of all sports coverage is for women, there's literally the only place to go is up from there, right? So I am extremely optimistic. I think that we were all a little bit afraid when the pandemic hit that all of the amazing strides women's sports had made in the last several years would be for naught. But at the same time, what people realized in not having sports was how much they love them. And being able to recognize that these women are incredible athletes and that they, if you're watching marble racing, you should probably also be watching professional basketball being played, even if it's by women. So I am optimistic going forward.
Great. And all right, Kylie, last thoughts. Again, appreciate your time and all you're doing. I know you're probably the least, sport person in terms of your focus, but in terms of long-term hope that sports can continue to be a driving force for change, if it arguably even is right now.
Yeah. And does it count that I'm 6 feet tall and have been asked my whole life if I play basketball? Like, does that count?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, good. Because then in that case, I'm in there. So yeah, I think that for us moving forward, we need to see tangible change. We need to see a willingness to explore white privilege. We need to accept the facts about who we are as a society, even if it means discovering uncomfortable truths about ourselves. We need to continue to uplift and amplify those who have carved a pathway for the activism that we see right now. We need to continuously be unafraid to use our platforms and our voices, because change does happen. This will work. And we have to remember that. It feels very difficult. It's a marathon. It's not a race, to use a sports analogy. It is something that we will consistently have to chip away at. It will require dedication and all of those things that I just named, but stay the course because it will work. And I also just want to uplift some names. We all can prattle off names of people, men mainly in present day, who've done a lot to promote within sports, who've done a lot to forward Black liberation. We can prattle off lots of names, but I just want to uplift a few names of women who we may not know that may be important to look up. And that is Wilma Rudolph, that is Earlene Brown, that is Wyomia Tyus, and some of our more contemporary sisters, Serena and Venus Williams and Naomi Osaka. So I just wanted to, say their names and make sure that they're acknowledged. And if you don't know who those women are, please learn about them. That's all. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate y'all's time. I hope that the audience enjoyed this. I hope everybody has a great night. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.